When I first saw Kubernetes, I was intimidated by all the configuration code. The good news is you can automate the generation of most of that code. In this video, I will show you how. Let's switch to the demo machine.
Okay, so this is demo 4 of 8 in a series on deploying Kubernetes applications. So here I am in my code editor for my sample events program. And at this point, we don't have the program deployed. So if I type kubectl get pods, notice I only have one pod. That's the database server that's already up and running. Now I want to be able to deploy my events app. Well, in the end, what I want to be able to do is go into this folder here, CD Kubernetes configurations, and then notice there's a bunch of YAML files in here. Now the YAML files describe the configuration that I want, and then once I have the YAML files, then to deploy the application, I type kubectl apply -f for file, and then the current folder, right? And then that deployed my configuration. So it said your events API was created, and there's a service for that was also created, and your database initializer was created, and your website was created, and there was a service running the website, so that was also created. So now when we type kubectl get pods, now we have a bunch of pods running our application, and if we type kubectl get services, then we see that we have our two services running that we could use to invoke our application. So that's how we can deploy. And then if we want to get rid of everything, then it's kubectl delete instead of apply -f, and then the name of all the files, and then everything will get deleted that we originally created, and now all that stuff is going to go away. But the question is, how in the heck did you create all of these YAML files, right? Because I remember when I was learning Kubernetes and the guy doing the demo, he would do that, and then that would be it, and say, look how fantastic that was. And then I was thinking, well, yeah, that's cool, but you have to create all of this code up here for all of that to work. So let's figure out how we can create all that code here without having to type it all in. Okay, so now let's go back. Let's first understand a little bit more about the kubectl CLI. So remember, like everything we want to do within our cluster, we're going to use kubectl to do it. So remember, like we can say kubectl get nodes, and that'll give us all the nodes in the cluster, or kubectl get pods, and that'll give us the pods in the cluster. But in addition to being able to get things, we can also create things. So let's type the command to create the website without the configuration code. So we could do that as well. So if we said kubectl create deployment, and then we give our deployment a name, so we'll call it events-web, and then there's a parameter called image, so we'll say image equals, and then the name of our Docker image. So remember, we in an earlier video, we put that image into Docker Hub. So the name of the image is drenstrom / events-web : v 1.0. Right. So, and then hit hit enter, and it says, okay, well, I've created your deployment events-web. And then now if we type kubectl get pods, we'll see now we have this pod running, which is an instance of our events-web program. And then now notice if I type kubectl get services, I still don't have the service that is fronting the website. So to create the service, the command would be kubectl expose. Well, what do you want to expose? I want to expose my deployment. So I'll say here deployments slash events web, like that. Right, so this is going to create the load balancer. So I'm going to type dash dash type equals load balancer. And then the load balancer is going to listen on port 80. And then it's going to route requests to the target port of 8080, because I know my program listens on 8080. So notice like this will create the load balancer for me, hopefully, if I didn't type anything wrong. So now it says the service has been exposed. So now let's go to kubectl get pods, and we have our pods running, and kubectl get services. And then here's our events web service. And then we want to test that in Minikube. So remember the command for that is minikube service. And then the name of our service, which is events-web, like that. And then that should route us to our program, which is running right here. Now, don't worry about this error for the time being. The reason we're getting the error is because we don't have the backend API up and running, so it can't connect to it. So we'll fix that later. Don't worry about that right now. But anyway, notice what we've done is instead of using the configuration files, we've used CLI to create the deployment and the service. Okay, so just understand. So I guess understand it up to that point. But now look, I don't want to do it that way. I want to have the configuration file. So let's delete what we just did. So to delete the service, we'll type kubectl delete services slash events web. And then to delete deployment, we'll type kubectl delete deployments slash web. And now when we type kubectl get all, we'll see our program is no longer running. So the pod is terminating. It's not quite gone yet. And then the service is gone. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to create those deployment files, right? So let's see if we can do that. Let me just create a temp folder here because I don't want to keep these. But we'll do let's make a directory called temp config, something like that, and then we're going to cd into that temp config folder. Now, if you recall, the command for creating the deployment was kubectl create deployment, and then we named it events-web, and then we had to specify the image. So we'll say image equals, and then the name of our image, which was drenstrom slash events web v1.0. Now, at this point, if we hit enter, it will create that deployment for us. But if we add one more parameter, dash dash dry dash run equal true, what that command says is don't really do it, right? And then there's another parameter, -o for output, and then I can specify the format of the output I want. So if I type YAML after that and then hit enter, then notice here that command gave me the deployment configuration for my application. So remember, like I don't want to have to type it in. So remember, like I'm just typing this command, create the deployment, but then don't really do it, dash dash dry run equal true, and then -o YAML, and then that'll return this. So I guess what I could do if I wanted to was just copy and paste all of this here and then put it into a text file. But there's a maybe a better way to do that. So in Unix, you can say arrow, arrow, and then we can output that to a YAML file. Remember, I'm in this folder temp-config, so I'm going to output the file. Why don't we call it? It doesn't matter. We can call it anything we want. So we'll call it events-web-deployment.yaml, like that. And then see if we can find that folder. All right, like here's our folder temp-config, and if we look in there, now we have this file, events-web.yaml, and there it is. Now, it's not, the whole thing is not there, okay? But I'm 80 to 90% done with creating that file. Now, what changes might I want to make? So maybe I would want to make this change here, where I want to have 3 replicas rather than just 1. So let's just see if that works. So there's our file right here, events web deployment. So let's test it out. So now we're going to do kubectl apply -f, and then that file that we just created, events web deployment, and then hit enter. And it said here our deployment was created. So now let's type clear and kubectl get pods. And now notice we have our 3 web application pods up and running. But now again, we have to put the load balancer in front of that. So if you remember, the command for creating the load balancer was kubectl expose. I'm going to expose my deployment, which we called eventsweb, events-web, and then we specify the type equals load balancer, and then our ports. So the load balancer listens on port 80, and then it routes requests to the target port, which is port 8080. Now remember what happened. If I hit enter now, that would create the load balancer, but I don't want to create the load balancer. I just want to create the configuration file. So I say --dry-run equals true, -o to output this as YAML, arrow, arrow, and we'll call this file events-web-service.yaml. And then hopefully I didn't spell anything wrong. And then hit enter, and it created this file for us right here. So now we have our service, and then our port configuration, and the type, and so on. And so now we can test that. Hopefully that's going to work, right? So let's do a clear again. And now we're going to say, or do ls. Now we want to deploy this file, events-web-service.yaml. So let's do kubectl apply -f, and the name of that file, and that should expose our service. And now we type kubectl get services. So there's the service we've just created. Hopefully that's going to work. Never know. So we'll type minikube service and the name of the service, and then that should route us to our website, which is up and running. But now we still got this problem here, right? We have no back end, right? So we have to deploy the API as well. So deploying the API is more of the same. So let's Control-C that, see how fast we can do that. So we're going to say kubectl create deployment. This is going to be called events-API, and then the image equals d-renstrom/events-API v1.0. Hopefully I didn't spell that wrong. Dash, or that's the image, and then remember, we don't really want to do it, so we're going to do -dry run equal to true, dry run equal to true. And then we're going to say minus O. We're going to output as YAML. And then we're going to save it to the file. Events dash API dash deployment dot YAML. Like that. So hopefully that's going to work. So that created this file right here. So there's events API YAML, which again, is just very similar to what we saw before, but now it's using a different image, right? So all that is good. And then ls, now let's deploy that. Copy that. So now we're going to say kubectl apply minus f and the name of that file. So that's going to create the API. Type kubectl get service or get pods. And now we should have our API up and running. So that's looking good. But now we have to expose it, right? So the command to expose it is just like what we saw before. So it's kubectl expose deployments slash events dash API, right? And then dash dash type equals load balancer dash dash port equals 80 dash dash target port equals 8082, which is the port that the API is listening on. I guess you just have to know that. So I assume you're the developer, right? So you should know how your program works. So there's our port, but remember, we don't want to actually do it. So we'll say dry-run equals true, minus O, output to YAML, to the file, and what do we want to call that? We'll call it events-API service.yaml, and then hit enter there. Oh, sorry, got to spell things right. So let's fix that. Hopefully that was my only typo. The deployment's there, so hopefully that worked. So here's our events API service that we've just created right here, and now we can deploy that as well. Okay. So again, let's do a clear and then ls. So now we want to deploy this file right here. So it's going to be kubectl apply minus f and then the name of this service right here. And that was created. Now if we say kubectl get services, we should see our events API service. Now, you're probably expecting if we go to the website, then it's going to work now. So let's test the website here. So we're going to say minikube service events-web and hit enter. And that's going to take us to the website right here. So now it ran that program, but we're still getting this error. But now let's look at that error a little bit more. It's saying error connection refused to 127.0.0.1:8082, right? So let's go in. We got to go in and dig into our code a little bit and see why we're still getting that error. So let's go back to our program here, events website, and then here's server.js. And then there's this variable right here at the top, constant server equals, and then this funny looking code right here is it says, this is a ternary expression in JavaScript. So it's saying, if this statement is true, then the value of this variable will equal this thing right here. Otherwise, it'll equal this thing right here. So it's saying, what we're doing is we're setting the value of the service variable, and we're saying if there is an environment variable called server, then we want to use it. If there's no environment variable called server, then we're just going to assume it's running on localhost 8082, which it's not running there, right? So what I got to do is inside my configuration, I have to add an environment variable called server that points to the web service that I've just created, my events web service. So remember when I said when we generated the configuration, it didn't get you the whole way there, but it got you most of the way there. So if we go back to those configuration files that we created, so this web deployment right here needs to have an environment variable added right here where it's being configured. So this spec section right here is configuring the pod, and then in the pod, a pod has one or more containers. So here's where I'm configuring my container, and then right here, I have to have an environment variable that sets that server property. So right here, I'm just going to paste, well, I'll just paste that in, cheat a little bit. I don't want to type it. But anyway, notice this is the environment variable section. We're creating a variable called server. And then this is pointing at the events API that we've just created. So that'll connect the website to the API, but the API has to connect to the database. So we have a similar problem there. So if we go look at the API code, here's my API code, and here's server.js. In this case, there are a number of environment variables that have to be set that allow us to make the connection to the database. So notice here, there's one called DB host, and DB user, and DB password, and then the name of the database, DB database. So I have to have values for all these. Now notice these all default. If these values aren't set, then it all defaults to my local machine, but that's not going to work when we're running in the Kubernetes cluster. So just like we saw here, where we created this environment variable, we're going to have to create environment variables in the API's deployment file right here so it can connect to its backend database. So let me paste in those files as well. So notice here are my 4 variables, DB host. Now this value here was given, that's the path to the service that provides access to my database. So that value was actually given to me when I installed the database. In a later video, we'll show you how to install the database. I'm just going to connect this root because I'm lazy. And then here's my database name, which is eventsdb. And then there's a password to the database. Now, I don't want to put that. I'm already being bad by connecting as root, but I definitely don't want to put the password of the database in the configuration file. So what happened was when we installed the database itself, let's open up Minikube dashboard real quick. So Minikube dashboard. When I deployed the database, which we'll see in a future video, it created a thing called a secret. And so the secret contains, so this is my database server MariaDB secret. So that secret contains the password that was automatically generated when the database was installed. So what I want to do is read the value of that secret in my configuration file, and that'll get me into the database. So notice for most of these, it's just hard coded, right? The DB user is the string root, but the DB password, I'm going to get the value of that from a secret, and the secret's name is database server -MariaDB, and inside there is a key value pair. So the key is MariaDB -root password, which will have the value of the password that I want to use. So that all gets put into the configuration. So at this point, everything should be, everything should be, or the deployment file should be configured, and we should be able to run them and deploy the application for real. So let's go back to Let's go back to our configuration right here. Now I'm going to redeploy everything. So let's see if that's going to work. So I've already deployed it, but now we've made some changes. So we're going to type kubectl apply -f, and then we'll apply the changes for all the files in the current folder. So now it's that all of these were configured. And now if we do kubectl get services, let's try it again. Hopefully it's going to work. So let's say minikube service events-web. And that'll open my program. And now notice my website is connecting to the API, and then the API is connecting to the backend database. But now, I guess the moral of the story is, look, we have to create these configuration files, or we want to create these configuration files, but we don't want to have to type them all in. I guess it depends on your job. If you're a high-priced consultant charging an exorbitant hourly rate, then maybe you want to type them all in based on the documentation. But if you're on salary and you want to go home and see your family, then you want to automatically generate them. And then once you automatically generate them, then you'll have to go in and make some more or less minor changes to them in order to deploy the application for your particular configuration. So hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, that's this video on simplifying the creation of Kubernetes configuration files. Join me for the next video, and we'll talk more about deploying applications to Kubernetes clusters. My name is Doug Renstrom with ROI Training.